Imagine fighting for your dream for nearly 20 years, enduring obscurity and countless setbacks. Then finally, you achieve it. The hit records are climbing the charts, your name is in lights, and the crowds are singing your songs back to you. And then, at the very peak of that hard-won success, a single phone call in the middle of the night erases everything. This wasn't a career-ending scandal or a fall from grace. It was a tragedy far more absolute. It was the sudden, violent death of his son in a car accident. The young man who wasn't just his child, but his touring drummer, the very heartbeat of his music. The artist forced to endure this unbearable reality was Narvel Felts, a man whose life is one of the most compelling and overlooked stories of resilience in music history. His story is a profound paradox, a pioneering rockabilly rebel at the legendary Sun Records, who was forgotten for decades, only to be reborn as Narvel the Marvel, a chart-topping country superstar in his late 30s. He overcame every professional obstacle imaginable, only to face his greatest test not on a stage, but in the silent aftermath of a devastating loss. On November 11, 1938, in the small, unincorporated community of Kaiser, Arkansas, Narvel Felts entered a world of profound hardship and hidden beauty. Kaiser wasn't just a dot on a map. It was the heart of the Mississippi Delta, an immense, flat, alluvial plain that was both a source of life and a place of relentless struggle. The Great Depression hadn't just visited the Delta. It had taken up permanent residence, leaving behind a landscape of economic desolation. Narvel's parents, Albert and Lena Felts, were sharecroppers. This was a system that, in practice, was little more than a form of modern-day serfdom. Families, like the Feltsies, lived on land they didn't own, worked fields of cotton and soybeans they would never profit from, and were perpetually in debt to the landowner. Their lives were a grueling, cyclical rhythm of planting and picking, governed by the unforgiving sun and the volatile price of cotton. It was a life of calloused hands, aching backs, and the constant gnawing anxiety of making ends meet. For a young boy like Narvel, growing up with his older sister Ogarita, this world was all he knew. His playground was the endless rows of cotton plants. His days were filled with the mundane, repetitive tasks of farm life. Education was a luxury, and dreams were often a dangerous indulgence. The poverty was not abstract, it was tangible. It was in the simple meals on the table, the patched-up clothes they wore, and the ever-present understanding that their future was largely predetermined. Yet the Mississippi Delta was also a place of extraordinary cultural richness. It was a pressure cooker of sound. This was the soil from which the blues had sprung, a raw, honest expression of the pain and perseverance of the African American communities who had worked this same land for generations. Though society was harshly segregated, the music was not so easily contained. The mournful slide of a bottleneck guitar, the powerful lament of a field holler, these sounds drifted through the humid air, seeping into the consciousness of everyone who lived there, black and white. And then there was the radio. In their small, humble home, a simple radio was a lifeline. It was a magical box that brought the outside world crashing into their isolated existence. Late at night, they could tune in to WSM in Nashville and hear the distant, cheerful sounds of the Grand Ole Opry. The voices of Roy Acuff, Ernest Tubb, and Hank Williams became familiar friends. They sang songs of heartbreak, faith, and the struggles of the common man, themes that resonated deeply with the Felts family. Their country music was plain-spoken and direct, a mirror to their own lives. On Sundays, another sound filled the air, gospel. From the small wooden-frame churches that dotted the landscape came a music of pure, unbridled spirit. It was a sound of hope in the face of despair, a promise of redemption. The powerful harmonies and soul-stirring conviction of gospel music taught a young Narvel a crucial lesson, that singing wasn't just about melody and words. It was about channeling pure, raw emotion. This unique trinity of sound, the deep sorrow of the blues, the narrative honesty of country, and the spiritual fire of gospel, formed the bedrock of Narvel Felts' musical identity. He didn't learn music from a book. He absorbed it from the very air he breathed. It was the soundtrack to his life of hardship, a secret language that spoke of a world beyond the cotton fields. He didn't know it yet, but this education in the Delta School of Sound was preparing him for a journey he could scarcely imagine. The poverty of his childhood limited his opportunities, but the richness of its music gave him a priceless gift, a voice that understood the fundamental truths of the human heart. The foundational sounds of the Delta had given Narvel a deep musical vocabulary, but it was a language without an outlet. The decision his family made to leave Arkansas for Missouri in search of a better life would prove to be the pivotal event that not only changed his circumstances, but sharpened his vague childhood interest in music into a focused, burning passion. This move north positioned him on the edge of a cultural revolution, providing him with the one tool he needed most, the desire for a voice of his own. By the early 1950s, a quiet exodus was underway across the American South. The post-war economy was shifting, and the sharecropping system, while still dominant, was slowly beginning to give way to agricultural mechanization. For families like the Feltses, the future in the Delta looked increasingly bleak. The promise of a better life, however modest, lay elsewhere. Like thousands of other rural families, Albert and Lena made a decision born of equal parts desperation and hope. They would migrate. In 1953, when Narvel was 14 years old, the family packed up their few belongings and left the only home they had ever known. Their destination was Powell, Missouri, a small community about 80 miles to the north. It wasn't a journey to a bustling metropolis. It was a move from one rural landscape to another. But those 80 miles represented a psychological chasm. They were leaving behind the familiar rhythms of the Arkansas Delta for the unknown territory of the Missouri Bootheel. This move was a pivotal moment in Narvel's young life. It was an uprooting that forced him to confront a new environment and new people. The landscape was different. The accents were subtly different. And for a teenager trying to find his place in the world, it was a profound displacement. He was now the new kid, the boy from Arkansas. This experience likely deepened his introspective nature, forcing him to rely more on his own inner world, a world increasingly filled with music. The family's hope was for better work, perhaps a plot of land to call their own one day, and a chance for their children to have a future that wasn't dictated by a landowner's ledger. Life in Missouri was still hard. The work was still demanding, and money was still scarce. But the change of scenery provided a crucial shift in perspective. It broke the cycle of familiarity and planted a seed in Narvel's mind that it was possible to leave one life behind and start another. It was in Missouri that his vague childhood interest in music began to sharpen into a focused passion. The sounds he'd absorbed in the Delta were still with him, but now, as a teenager in the mid-1950s, those sounds were colliding with something new, something explosive that was beginning to crackle through the radio waves. A new rebellion was brewing, and it was coming from just down the road in Memphis, Tennessee. The family's gamble to move north had placed Narvel in the right place at the right time, positioning him on the edge of a cultural revolution that was about to ignite and providing him with the one tool he needed most, the burning desire for a voice of his own. That burning desire, ignited by the electrifying new sounds crackling through the radio, demanded an instrument. The story of how he acquired his first guitar, a battered, wire-strung vessel for his ambition, and taught himself to play, is the stuff of legend. From the lonely hours of practice in his room to a single explosive performance at a high school talent show, Narvel transformed himself from a quiet farm boy into a local sensation, taking the first definitive steps on a journey that would lead him from the airwaves of Missouri to the very heart of the rock and roll firestorm, Memphis. For a teenager in rural Missouri in 1954, the world could feel incredibly small. Life was a predictable loop of school, chores, and church. But at night, a revolution was being broadcast. As Narvel huddled close to the family radio, turning the dial past the farm reports and the local news, he was searching for a signal from another planet, and he found it. It came in the form of a swaggering, raw, and electrifying sound that was unlike anything he had ever heard. It was the sound of Sun Records in Memphis. It was Sam Phillips's perfect, chaotic concoction of blues, country, and gospel, supercharged with a youthful, defiant energy. One voice in particular cut through the static and changed everything. It was the voice of Elvis Presley. Hearing That's All Right or Heartbreak Hotel for the first time was not a passive experience for Narvel Felts. It was a seismic event. This wasn't the polished, polite music of the mainstream pop charts. This was dangerous. It was visceral. Elvis's voice, with its hiccuping, soulful delivery, sounded like it was channeling all the frustrations and desires of a generation. For a poor farm boy who felt trapped by his circumstances, this music was the sound of liberation. It was a roar of individuality, a declaration that you could be whoever you wanted to be. He was instantly, irrevocably hooked. He began to devour the music of the other Sun pioneers, the frantic, propulsive guitar of Carl Perkins, the swaggering bravado of Jerry Lee Lewis, the dark, resonant authority of Johnny Cash. This was his music. It spoke his language. It was the delta sounds of his childhood, but reborn as something new, urgent, and rebellious. He didn't just want to listen to it, he needed to make it. But there was a problem. He didn't have an instrument. A brand new guitar was a laughable extravagance, as unattainable as a new car. So he did what he had always done. He worked. He took on extra jobs, likely picking cotton or doing whatever manual labor he could find, saving every nickel and dime in a hidden jar or sock drawer. His goal was $15. In today's money, that's roughly $150, but for a teenager from a low-income family in the 1950s, it was a king's ransom. The day he finally saved enough, he acquired his first guitar. It has become a legendary part of his story, and for good reason. It wasn't a gleaming, beautiful instrument from a fancy music store. It was a used, battered, second-hand acoustic, scarred with the stories of its previous owners. It was in such rough shape that its very structure was compromised. And Narvel, with the practical ingenuity of a farm boy, had to rig it with baling wire just to keep it from falling apart. That wire-strung guitar is the single most important symbol of his entire career. It represents his grit, his resourcefulness, and his absolute refusal to be deterred by his circumstances. It was imperfect, held together by sheer will, and yet it was capable of producing music. It was in essence a perfect metaphor for Narvel himself. He had no money for lessons. There were no YouTube tutorials or music schools in Powell, Missouri. His only teachers were the radio and his own 2 ears. He would spend countless hours in his room listening to a Carl Perkins record, dropping the needle again and again, trying to make his clumsy, calloused fingers replicate the lightning-fast licks. It was a slow, frustrating process. There were moments of doubt, of wanting to smash the cheap guitar against the wall, but his passion was stronger than his frustration. He taught himself chords, rhythm, and melody not by theory, but by feel. He learned to sing by mimicking his heroes, but slowly his own voice began to emerge, a high, clear tenor with a natural, mournful cry that was all his own. That battered guitar and that crackling radio were his conservatory, and the lonely hours spent practicing were his education. He was building his dream from scratch with nothing but scrap parts and an unbreakable will. By 1956, Narvel Felts was no longer just a farm boy who played guitar in his bedroom. He had become a musician. Music was now the center of his identity, the lens through which he saw the world. He was still quiet and unassuming in his daily life, but when he strapped on that wire-strung guitar, a different person emerged, someone confident, energetic, and full of the rebellious spirit of rock and roll. His friends and classmates at Bernie High School started to notice. The annual school talent show was the biggest event of the year, a local stage for aspiring singers, comedians, and performers. For most, it was a bit of fun, a chance to get on stage for a few minutes. For Narvel, it was an opportunity. It was the first real test of whether the music he was making in private could connect with an audience. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. Getting on stage in front of everyone he knew, teachers, friends, rivals, required a special kind of courage. He chose his weapon carefully. Blue suede shoes, the iconic anthem by his hero, Carl Perkins. It was the perfect choice. The song was a statement, a defiant, swaggering piece of rockabilly that was sweeping the nation. It was a song that demanded not just to be sung, but to be performed. When the night of the show arrived, the school auditorium was buzzing with nervous energy. One can only imagine Narvel standing backstage, his heart pounding in his chest, the worn wood of his guitar cool against his hands. When his name was called, he walked into the spotlight. He likely looked like any other teenager from rural Missouri, in simple clothes, maybe with his hair slicked back. But the moment he struck the first chord, everything changed. He didn't just play the song, he attacked it. He channeled all the energy of Perkins, all the rebellion of Elvis, and all of his own pent-up passion into that single performance. His voice, clear and strong, cut through the nervous silence of the auditorium. He moved with the music, a natural showman who had been hiding in plain sight. For those 3 minutes, he wasn't Albert and Lena's quiet son. He was a rock and roll star. The reaction was immediate and electric. The students, who had grown up on a diet of polite pop and traditional country, were stunned. They erupted in applause. It was more than just approval. It was a moment of recognition. They saw one of their own transform into something bigger, something exciting. But the most important reaction came from one specific person in the crowd, a local disc jockey from KDEX. The radio station in the nearby town of Dexter happened to be in the audience that night. In a small town, the local DJ was a kingmaker, the gatekeeper of the airwaves. He heard what the students heard, but with a professional ear. He heard raw, unpolished, undeniable talent. He heard a voice that belonged on the radio. After the show, the DJ approached the triumphant, sweat-soaked teenager. The conversation that followed would alter the course of Narvel Felts' life forever. Impressed by his talent and stage presence, the DJ offered him something unimaginable, his own weekend show on KDEX. It was a staggering proposition. Suddenly, the boy who learned to play by listening to the radio was being given a chance to be on the radio. That high school talent show was the spark that lit the fuse. It validated his secret dream, proving that his passion wasn't just a hobby. It was a calling. It gave him his first taste of public adoration. And more importantly, it opened the first professional door. The journey from the cotton fields of Arkansas to the stage of Bernie High had been a long one, but a new journey was just beginning. One that would lead him from the local airwaves of Missouri to the legendary recording studios of Memphis, and a date with destiny at the epicenter of the rock and roll explosion. Becoming a local celebrity was one thing. Conquering the music world was another. Armed with a radio show and a newly formed band, the Rockets, Narvel honed his craft in the rough and tumble dance halls of the Missouri-Arkansas border. But the magnetic pull of Memphis and the legendary Sun Records was too strong to ignore. His pilgrimage to the holy city of rock and roll led him to an audition, a record deal, and invaluable mentorship from giants like Roy Orbison and Johnny Cash. Yet he would soon learn that in a studio crowded with future legends, talent alone was no guarantee of stardom. For a 17-year-old in rural America, fame wasn't a global concept. It wasn't about television appearances or magazine covers. Fame was the sound of your name being spoken with a little more respect in the town diner. It was the feeling of people turning their heads when you walked down the street. After his electrifying performance at the Bernie High Talent Show, Narvel Felts became for the first time famous. But it was his subsequent gig at radio station KDEX that transformed him from a one-night wonder into a legitimate local celebrity, setting the stage for a much larger gamble, a journey into the very heart of the rock and roll firestorm, Memphis, Tennessee. This next chapter of his life is not one of instant stardom. It is a story of dues paying, of honing his craft in the smoky, beer-soaked honky-tonks and dance halls that dotted the border of Missouri and Arkansas. It's the story of forming a band of brothers, the Rockets, and learning how to command a stage. And most importantly, it's the story of walking through the doors of the most mythical studio in the world, Sun Records, where he would come face to face with his heroes and be forced to confront the colossal difference between having talent and becoming a star. He was about to learn that in Memphis, even giants could get lost in the shadows of kings. The offer from the KDX disc jockey was more than a job. It was an anointing. For a teenager obsessed with the music crackling from the radio, being given the keys to the station even for a few hours a week was the ultimate validation. His weekend show quickly became a local institution. Narvel wasn't just a disembodied voice. He was the kid from just down the road who had made good. He played the hits of the day, Elvis, Perkins, Fats Domino, but he also instinctively understood his audience. He spun the country records they loved, the soulful R&B that was just starting to cross over, and, of course, the explosive new sound of Rockabilly. But the radio show was just one part of his new life. The talent show had given him recognition. The radio gave him a platform. What he needed now was a band. He sought out other young local musicians who shared his fire, and together they formed Narvel Felts and the Rockets. The name was perfect for the era, evoking speed, power, and the futuristic promise of the space age. The Rockets weren't just hired hands. They were a tight-knit unit, a gang of rock and roll missionaries. They rehearsed relentlessly, cramming into a living room or a garage, their cheap amplifiers buzzing as they tried to replicate the raw energy of the records they loved. With the band in place, Narvel graduated from the school auditorium to the professional circuit. This circuit was a patchwork of school dances, county fairs, community centers, and, most importantly, the rough and tumble honky-tonks and roadhouses that catered to a working-class crowd. These were not glamorous venues. They were loud, smoky, and sometimes dangerous places where fights could break out as easily as a dance. For a young band, it was a trial by fire. You had to be loud enough to be heard over the crowd, tight enough to keep them dancing, and tough enough to handle whatever the night threw at you. This is where Narvel Felts truly learned to be a performer. He wasn't just singing songs, he was putting on a show. He learned how to read a crowd, how to build a set list that would take them on a journey, when to hit them with a fast-paced rocker, and when to slow it down with a heartfelt ballad. He developed his stage presence, moving with a natural charismatic energy. His voice, already a powerful instrument, grew stronger and more confident with every performance. He and the Rockets became a formidable live act, building a devoted following across southeast Missouri and northeast Arkansas. They were local heroes, the soundtrack to 1,000 Saturday nights. For a time, this was enough. The thrill of a packed dance floor, the camaraderie of the band, the respect of his community, it was a dream come true. But the crackle of the radio still held a siren's call, and all the signals were coming from one place. In the mid-1950s, for any aspiring rock and roll musician in the South, all roads led to Memphis. The city had become the undisputed capital of this new musical universe, a place where history was being made on a daily basis. It was more than a city. It was an idea. It was the place where a truck driver named Elvis had become a king, where country boys and bluesmen had collided to create a sound that was shaking the world. At the heart of this idea was a small, unassuming building at 706 Union Avenue, Sun Records. The stories that came out of Sun were the stuff of legend. Sam Phillips, the visionary, almost mystical producer, wasn't just recording songs. He was capturing lightning in a bottle. He had an uncanny ear for raw, authentic talent, and he had created an environment where artists were free to be themselves, to break the rules, and to invent the future. For Narvel and the Rockets, who had spent months trying to replicate the Sun sound, the thought of actually recording there was the ultimate ambition. So in 1957, they made the pilgrimage. Piling into a car with their instruments and their hopes, they drove south. One can imagine the conversation on that drive, a mixture of nervous excitement, youthful bravado, and a deep underlying fear of failure. They were leaving the relative safety of their local fame and heading into the major leagues. As they crossed the state line into Tennessee and the outskirts of Memphis came into view, the reality of what they were doing must have set in. Memphis was a sensory overload. The air was thick with humidity and music. From the doorways of the clubs on Beale Street spilled a raucous mix of blues, jazz, and R&B. The city was alive, a vibrant, chaotic symphony of sound. This was the world that had given birth to their heroes. It was exhilarating, but also deeply intimidating. They were no longer the biggest fish in a small pond. In Memphis, they were just another hopeful band with a dream, one of dozens that descended on the city every week, all seeking the same prize. Their destination was clear. They drove to that fabled address, pulled up to the curb, and looked at the simple storefront with the iconic Sun logo. They had arrived at the center of their universe. Now, they just had to prove they belonged there. Walking into Sun Studio was like stepping into a sacred space. It was surprisingly small, a simple rectangular room that felt more like a local business office than the birthplace of a revolution. But the air itself seemed to vibrate with the echoes of the music that had been made there. This was the room where Elvis had nervously sung My Happiness, where Johnny Cash had laid down the boom-chicka-boom rhythm of I Walk the Line, where Jerry Lee Lewis had hammered the piano into submission on Whole Lotta Shakin' Goin' On. For Narvel and his band, the sense of history must have been overwhelming. Their audition was likely for Sam Phillips's trusted engineer and producer, Jack Clement, a brilliant and eccentric musician in his own right. The pressure was immense. In that room, there was nowhere to hide. The studio's famous acoustics, a product of its angled ceiling tiles and Phillips' genius, captured every nuance, every flaw. You couldn't fake it at Sun. You either had it or you didn't. Narvel and the Rockets plugged in and played with everything they had. They unleashed the tight, energetic sound they had perfected in the honky-tonks. And in Narvel's voice, Clement and the other studio hands heard something special. It was a pure country tenor, but with a soulful flexibility that could handle the bluesy swagger of rock and roll. It was clear and powerful, with a hint of that high, lonesome sound that could convey deep emotion. They passed the audition. They were now Sun Records recording artists. This achievement alone was monumental, but what happened next would shape Narvel's musical identity for the rest of his life. Sun in the late 50s was a collaborative, almost chaotic hub of creativity. Established artists would often hang around the studio listening to sessions, offering advice, and waiting for their own inspiration to strike. It was during this period that Narvel fell into the orbit of two of Sun's reigning giants, and these encounters became one of the great secret histories of his career. The first was with Roy Orbison. Orbison was already a star, but he was also a musician's musician, fascinated by vocal technique. He heard in Narvel a kindred spirit, another singer with an unusually high and emotional vocal range. As the story goes, Orbison took a direct interest in the young singer from Missouri. He recognized the raw potential of Narvel's falsetto, but saw that it was largely uncontrolled. In informal sessions, likely in a quiet corner of the studio between takes, Orbison gave him a master class. He taught Narvel how to transition smoothly into his falsetto, how to control his breathing, to hold the high notes with power, and most importantly, how to use it not as a flashy trick, but as a tool of emotional expression, a way to convey vulnerability, desperation, and soaring joy. This mentorship was the key that unlocked the most distinctive part of Narvel's voice, the signature sound that would later make him famous. His other significant encounter was with Johnny Cash. Cash was the conscience of Sun Records, the man in black whose voice carried the weight of the working man's soul. He and Narvel came from similar stock, poor, rural, southern boys who understood the realities of a life of hard labor. Cash's advice was less technical and more philosophical. He spoke to Narvel about the importance of authenticity. He stressed that to connect with an audience, a singer had to believe what he was singing. He encouraged Narvel to find the truth in a lyric, to tell a story, and to never forget the people he was singing for. It was a lesson in artistic integrity that stayed with Narvel for his entire career. Armed with this invaluable guidance, Narvel began his recording sessions. He and the Rockets cut several tracks, full of fire and promise. Their first single, Like Kiss-A-Me Baby, was a solid piece of upbeat rockabilly. But despite the quality of the recordings and the magic of the studio, a major national hit proved to be a frustratingly elusive target. The great paradox of Narvel Felts' time at Sun Records was one of timing. He had arrived at the party, but the guest of honor had already left the building, and the new headliners were commanding all the attention. By 1957, Elvis Presley was no longer a Sun artist. He was a global entity, the biggest star in the world. His departure had left a huge void, and Sam Phillips was desperately, almost manically trying to fill it. This created an atmosphere of intense Darwinian competition. Sun was flooded with talent. On any given day, you might find Carl Perkins working on a new guitar lick, Johnny Cash writing a somber ballad, or, most formidably, Jerry Lee Lewis unleashing his demonic fury on the studio piano. The killer was Sun's new priority, the heir apparent to Elvis's throne of rebellious energy. He was exciting, unpredictable, and dangerous, and he was soaking up most of the label's promotional energy and resources. Into this pressure, Cooker walked Narvel Felts. He was immensely talented, a great singer, and a charismatic performer. But in the context of Sun in 1957, that wasn't enough. He wasn't the brooding poet that Cash was. He wasn't the guitar innovator that Perkins was. And he certainly wasn't the force of nature that was Jerry Lee Lewis. He was a fantastic rockabilly artist in a studio overflowing with them. His records did well on a regional level. The blistering 1958 instrumental Rocket Ride became a local hit, a showcase of the band's tight musicianship. But they struggled to get airplay on national radio. The market was saturated, and DJs were inundated with records from hundreds of hopefuls who sounded to the casual ear a lot like Narvel Felts. It wasn't a failure of talent, but a failure to break through the noise. He was a brilliant flash of light in a sky already filled with exploding stars. He had gained an incredible education, recorded in the most famous studio in the world, and rubbed shoulders with legends. He had a handful of fantastic recordings to his name that would later earn him a place in the Rockabilly Hall of Fame. But the dream of national stardom, the kind he had heard through his radio back in Missouri, remained tantalizingly out of grasp. As the 1950s came to a close, the rockabilly craze itself began to wane. The music was evolving, becoming more polished and pop-oriented. Narvel's time at the legendary label was ending. He had come to Memphis seeking a throne, but had found only a crowded court. The next decade would demand a different kind of survival, a long period of wandering in a musical wilderness, forcing him to question everything he thought he knew about success and what it would take to keep his dream and his family alive. The end of the rockabilly era marked the beginning of a long, humbling decade for Narvel. As the 1960s unfolded, he found himself a man out of time, a master of a sound the world was forgetting. This period became his wilderness years, a time of frustrating near misses on a new record label and a profound personal reckoning. Faced with the choice between the uncertain gamble of fame and the undeniable reality of a growing family, he made the quiet sacrifice that defined him not as a star, but as a man, setting the stage for the most improbable second act in music history. The end of the 1950s was more than just the turning of a page on a calendar. It was the closing of a book. The first wild chapter of rock and roll, the era of raw, untamed, sun-drenched rebellion, was over. The pioneers were either gone, humbled, or transformed. Elvis was in the army, soon to be repackaged for Hollywood. Jerry Lee Lewis was disgraced. Chuck Berry was in legal trouble. The untamed energy that had launched 1,000 careers was being replaced by something more calculated, more polished, more corporate. For a musician like Narvel Felts, whose entire identity had been forged in the crucible of 1950s rockabilly, this new decade felt like a foreign country. He had stood in the hallowed halls of Sun Records. He had the respect of legends, and he had a voice that could stand with the best of them. But he was a master of a language that the world was quickly ceasing to speak. The 1960s would become his wilderness years. This is the part of the story often glossed over, the long, difficult decade between the rockabilly flash and the country superstardom. It was a time of frustrating near misses, of trying to fit into a world that had no place for him. But more than that, it was a time of profound personal choices, where the glamorous, uncertain dream of fame would collide with the undeniable reality of a family that depended on him. It was in this wilderness, far from the spotlight, that Narvel Felts would make the decision that defined him not as a star, but as a man. As the 1960s dawned, the music industry was undergoing a seismic shift. The raw, minimalist productions of Sun Records were giving way to new, dominant sounds. From the Brill Building in New York came a tidal wave of sophisticated, tightly crafted pop songs for teen idols and girl groups. Across the Atlantic, the first rumblings of the British invasion were beginning to stir. And in Nashville, producers like Chet Atkins and Owen Bradley were smoothing the rough edges off country music, creating the lush, string-laden Nashville sound designed for crossover appeal. For an artist like Narvel, this new landscape was treacherous. His authentic, high-energy rockabilly style suddenly sounded dated, a relic from a bygone era. His time at Sun Records, once a badge of honor, now marked him as part of the old guard. The parting of ways with the legendary label was not acrimonious. It was simply a matter of pragmatism. Sam Phillips was moving on, and so was the world. Narvel's talent, however, was still undeniable. In 1959, he signed a contract with Mercury Records, a major label with far greater resources and distribution than Sun. On paper, this was a significant step up. It was a chance to break out of the regional circuit and onto the national stage. But the move from the familial, chaotic creativity of Sun to the corporate structure of Mercury was a culture shock. At Sunday, Sam Phillips nurtured artists and captured their raw essence. At Mercury, the A&R men, artists, and repertoire were looking for hits. They were less interested in an artist's vision and more interested in what would sell in a rapidly changing marketplace. The pressure was immediate and intense. Narvel was no longer a big fish in the small pond of southeast Missouri, nor was he a hungry contender in the legendary arena of Sun. He was now a very small fish in a vast corporate ocean, competing for attention with hundreds of other artists on the label's roster. The question was no longer just, can you sing? It was, can you sell records in 1960? To do that, Narvel Felts would have to reinvent himself. The early 1960s saw Narvel Felts become a musical chameleon, driven by the label's desperate search for a hit. His rockabilly roots were pushed to the background, and he was encouraged to try on a variety of new musical hats. He recorded teen-oriented pop, slick Nashville-style country, and even ventured into the territory of rhythm and blues. He was a gifted mimic with a versatile voice, able to adapt to almost any style. But in adapting so well, he risked losing the very thing that made him unique. His producers at Mercury saw potential for him as a pop balladeer, a sort of grittier Southern answer to the teen idols of the day. It was in this vein that he recorded a cover of the Drifters' soulful 1959 classic, Honey Love. The song was a perfect vehicle for his voice, allowing him to use his powerful tenor and soaring falsetto in a new, more polished context. The arrangement was professional, the production was slick, and the performance was flawless. In 1960, Honey Love was released, and for a moment it looked like the breakthrough was finally happening. The song began to get airplay. It slowly climbed the charts, eventually landing at number 90 on the Billboard Hot 100. For Narvel, this was a taste of real national success. It wasn't a smash hit, but it was a foothold. It was proof that he could compete on the national stage. The frustration, however, was that it peaked too early. It was a minor hit, a momentary flash that failed to ignite a larger fire. It gave him a glimpse of the promised land, only to have the door close again. He continued to record for Mercury and other labels throughout the early 60s, releasing a string of well-crafted but commercially unsuccessful singles. He tried his hand at straight country with tracks like Mountain of Love in 1963, a song that showcased his natural affinity for the genre. He released more pop-oriented material. Each single was a new roll of the dice, a new hope that this might be the one. But the hits never came. This period was a grueling lesson in the fickle nature of the music business. He was doing everything right. He was working with professional producers. He was singing beautifully. He was trying every style they threw at him. But he simply couldn't gain traction. The musical zeitgeist had moved on. The British invasion, led by the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, had completely reshaped the sound of popular music, making his brand of classic American rock and pop seem quaint by comparison. He was a man out of time, a brilliant artist playing to a world that was listening to something else entirely. While Narvel's professional life was a frustrating cycle of hope and disappointment, his personal life was entering a new profound chapter. His marriage to his sweetheart Loretta remained his anchor in the turbulent waters of the music industry. They had a daughter, Stacia, and in 1964, Loretta gave birth to their son, Narvel Bub Jr. The birth of his son was a moment of immense joy, but it also brought with it a heavy weight of responsibility. Narvel was now a father of two. The dream of being a music star, which had once been a thrilling personal ambition, now had to be weighed against the practical, pressing need to provide a stable life for his wife and children. The reality of his situation was stark. The minor success of Honey Love hadn't translated into financial security. The life of a recording artist without major hits was one of inconsistent, unpredictable income. It meant long, lonely weeks on the road, playing for small crowds in distant towns, often for little more than gas money. He was faced with a choice that countless artists have confronted, a true crossroads of life. He could continue to chase the dream with relentless, single-minded focus. This would mean being an absent husband and father, gambling their family's security on the long-shot hope of another hit. Or he could make a different choice. He could put his family first. Narvel Felts made the quiet sacrifice. He chose his family. This wasn't a dramatic overnight decision to quit music. It was a gradual, pragmatic shift in priorities. He eased back from the relentless pursuit of a national career. He turned down the grueling, low-paying tours that would take him away from home for extended periods. Instead, he focused on providing a steady income. He took on odd jobs in his community. While the exact details are private, it's easy to imagine him doing the kind of hard, honest work he had grown up around. Perhaps working in construction, farming, or taking a job as a salesman. This was the dark secret of his career, not because it was shameful, but because it was so profoundly normal. At the very moment his contemporaries were living the high life of rock and roll stardom, Narvel Felts was likely getting up early, putting on a pair of work boots, and heading off to a job to make sure there was food on the table and the bills were paid. He put his ego aside and did what a husband and father does. He never stopped playing music. It was too much a part of him. He continued to play gigs locally on weekends and evenings. His music became a beloved part of the community fabric rather than a commercial product for a national audience. But the dream of the big time, of seeing his name at the top of the charts, was packed away. It was a noble, deeply personal decision that would have ended the story for almost anyone else. For Narvel, however, this decade of living a normal life was not an ending, but an essential unspoken preparation for the incredible chapter that was yet to come. The world largely forgot about Narvel Felts as the 1960s wore on. To the mainstream music industry, he was a footnote, a promising rockabilly kid from the 50s who never quite made it. But a strange thing was happening across the Atlantic. In Europe, and particularly in the UK and Germany, a passionate cult following for original American rockabilly was growing. Fans and collectors sought out the old, obscure records from Sun High and Meteor Records. For these purists, Narvel Felts wasn't a forgotten artist. He was a legend. His early Sun recordings were prized possessions, Revered for their raw energy and authenticity, this overseas reputation provided a faint, enduring light during his wilderness years. It was a reminder that the music he had made still mattered, that it still had the power to move people even thousands of miles away. It was a source of pride and perhaps a small, crucial spark that kept his artistic ambition from being completely extinguished. Domestically, he continued to live his dual life, a working man by day, a musician by night. The years of struggle and responsibility were subtly changing him as an artist. His voice, always a remarkable instrument, was maturing. It was gaining a new depth, a richer, emotional timbre. When he sang a ballad, it was no longer with the hopeful angst of a young man, but with the lived-in weariness and wisdom of a man who understood sacrifice and quiet disappointment. This period, which seemed like a long, fallow detour, was in fact an essential incubation. He was living the very life that country music at its best chronicles: the joys and struggles of family, the dignity of hard work, the pain of dreams deferred. He wasn't insulated in the celebrity bubble of Nashville or Los Angeles. He was grounded in the real world, experiencing the same challenges as his audience. As the decade drew to a close, Narvel Felts was in his early 30s. To the outside world, his moment had passed. He was a husband, a father, a respected member of his community, and a part-time musician. The explosive dream of his youth seemed like a distant memory, but the fire had not gone out. It had simply been banked, smoldering quietly, gathering heat. The world didn't know it yet, but it was about to witness one of the most unlikely, unexpected, and triumphant second acts in American music history. The wilderness years were over. A new dawn was about to break. As history circled back on itself, the changing sound of country music in the early 1970s unknowingly created a space perfectly shaped for Narvel's unique voice. The decade of living a normal life had given him a new depth, and a small independent record label was about to take a gamble that would pay off spectacularly. This next chapter is not just a comeback. It's the story of how a forgotten pioneer, armed with a once-in-a-generation voice, would rise from obscurity to be reborn as Narvel the Marvel, one of the biggest country stars of the era. A decade is a lifetime in the music business. The 1960s had been a long, humbling wilderness for Narvel Felts, a period where the roar of the crowd was replaced by the quiet rhythm of family life and the steady demands of a day job. The dream of stardom hadn't died, but it had gone into a deep hibernation, a faint, smoldering ember that seemed destined to burn out. He was no longer a hot young prospect. He was a man in his 30s, a husband and a father, with a history that most of the industry had already forgotten. But history has a funny way of circling back on itself. While Narvel was living a life of quiet dignity, the world of music was once again changing. The very sounds he had experimented with out of necessity in the 60s, the soul, the pop, the heartfelt balladry, were now seeping into the country music mainstream. The industry was unknowingly creating a space that was perfectly, miraculously shaped for a voice like his. This next chapter is not just a comeback story. It is one of the most improbable and inspiring second acts in music history. It's the story of how a forgotten rockabilly pioneer, armed with nothing but a once-in-a-generation voice and a decade of lived experience, would rise from obscurity to become one of the biggest country stars of the 1970s. The world was about to be reintroduced to Narvel Felts, and this time they would give him a new name: Narvel the Marvel. The early 1970s saw country music wearing a new suit. The raw, gritty honky-tonk sound of the 50s and the slick, string-laden Nashville sound of the 60s were coalescing into something new. Country Politan. It was a sound as ambitious as its name, blending the emotional core of country with the sophisticated production of pop and the deep, soulful feeling of R&B. Artists like Conway Twitty were delivering passionate, romantic ballads that made women swoon. Charlie Pride was breaking barriers with his smooth, rich baritone, and Charlie Rich, another former Sun Records rockabilly artist, was finding massive success as the Silver Fox, crooning soulful piano-driven epics. This new era valued something different. It wasn't about rebellious energy. It was about emotional vulnerability. It wasn't about raw power. It was about vocal control and nuance. It was a style of music for adults, singing about adult heartbreak, love, and loss. Unbeknownst to the Nashville hitmakers, they were creating the perfect environment for Narvel Felts to return. His entire career had been a training ground for this exact moment. His country upbringing gave him the authentic foundation. His frustrating attempts at R&B and pop in the 60s had made him a versatile, soulful singer. And that incredible soaring falsetto, the one Roy Orbison had helped him master, was a unique and powerful weapon in an era that prized dramatic, emotional vocals. The musical world had finally caught up to him. All he needed was one more chance to prove it. Even during the lean years, Narvel had never stopped performing. He was a fixture in the local Missouri music scene. His talent an open secret. He played with a quiet professionalism, his voice only getting richer and more resonant with age. The years of living a normal life had stripped away any youthful pretense, leaving behind a pure, honest artistry. He wasn't chasing a trend anymore. He was just singing from the heart. And a few perceptive people were beginning to notice that his heart was speaking a language the whole country was ready to hear. The path back to the national stage didn't begin with a major label in Nashville. It began, as it often does, with a believer. A new manager saw Narvel performing and was stunned by what he heard. He saw not a has-been, but a star in waiting, an artist whose time had finally come. This manager began shopping Narvel's name around, and he found a receptive ear at a small, independent label out of Nashville called Cinnamon Records. Cinnamon was an underdog, a small player trying to compete with the giants of RCA and Columbia. They couldn't afford to sign the biggest names, so they had to be smarter. They had to find unique, overlooked talent. In Narvel Felts, they saw a golden opportunity. They heard the voice, they knew his history, and they took a gamble. In 1973, they signed him to a record deal. Narvel, now 35 years old, walked back into a recording studio. This wasn't the mythical, primitive Sun studio of his youth, nor was it the indifferent corporate environment of Mercury. This was a place of hope, a last-ditch effort to reclaim a dream. The label knew his strengths, and they had an idea. The song Drift Away, written by Mentor Williams, and made a massive pop and soul hit by Dobie Gray just a year earlier, was still a radio staple. It was a beloved song, a seemingly untouchable classic. To cover it so soon was a huge risk. But the label and Narvel's producer heard something different in it. They stripped away the rock and soul arrangement and reimagined it as a heartfelt country ballad. The session was a moment of pure alchemy. Narvel stepped up to the microphone, no longer a kid trying to be Elvis, no longer a chameleon trying to fit in. He was simply himself, a man with a lifetime of experience and a voice that could convey it all. He sang the opening lines, beginning to think that I'm wasting my time and I don't understand the things I do. And the words felt less like a song lyric and more like a personal confession. It was the story of his last 10 years. When he reached the chorus pleading to be lost in the solace of rock and roll, his voice soared with a mixture of pain and release. He poured all the years of waiting, all the quiet sacrifices for his family, and all his enduring love for music into that single performance. It wasn't a cover song. It was his autobiography. When Cinnamon Records released Narvel's version of Drift Away in late 1973, the reaction from country radio was immediate and overwhelming. In a world of polished baritones, Narvel's high, soulful tenor cut through like a lightning bolt. DJs and listeners were captivated. Who was this singer? Where did this incredible voice come from? The song began its steady, inexorable climb up the Billboard country charts. For Narvel and his wife Loretta, it must have felt like a dream. After a decade of silence, hearing his voice coming from car radios and jukeboxes across the country was a profound emotional vindication. Every spin of the record was a testament to their shared resilience, a reward for the faith they had kept when all seemed lost. This wasn't just his success, it was their success. Drift Away peaked at number 8, a massive hit that firmly reestablished Narvel Felts as a national recording artist. But this time, it felt different. The minor success of Honey Love had been fleeting. This was substantial. This was the beginning of something real. The song didn't just give him a hit, it gave him a new identity. He was no longer a rockabilly revivalist or a pop singer. He was a master of soulful country music. The industry, which had written him off as a relic of the 50s, was now scrambling to catch up. Narvel Felts was back, and his true golden era was just about to begin. The success of Drift Away opened the floodgates. Now signed to ABC/Dot Records, a major label that had absorbed his contract, Narvel had the full backing of a music industry powerhouse. For the next 5 years, he was one of the most consistent and beloved hitmakers in country music. The sound he had stumbled upon, heartfelt, soul-infused country ballads, was a formula for massive success. The absolute pinnacle came in 1975 with the release of Reconsider Me. The song, an aching ballad of romantic regret and a plea for a second chance, was the perfect vehicle for his emotive voice. His performance was a masterpiece of vulnerability and power. It resonated with audiences on a deep universal level. Reconsider Me shot to number 2 on the U.S. country charts and hit number 1 in Canada, becoming the second biggest country song of the entire year. It was his signature song, his magnum opus, the track that cemented his place in the top tier of country superstars. The hits kept coming with astonishing regularity. He took the Willie Nelson-penned classic Funny How Time Slips Away and made it his own. He transformed Jackie Wilson's R&B hit Lonely Teardrops into a country soul anthem, his falsetto crying out with a pain that was palpable. He scored again and again with songs like Somebody, Hold Me, Until She Passes By, and a soulful cover of Everlasting Love. In a 5-year span, he charted more than a dozen major hits. His albums were equally successful. His 1975 self-titled LP, Narvel Felts, flew to number 4 on the album charts. He followed it with Narvel the Marvel in 1976, which also broke the top 10. It was during this incredible run that his devoted fans gave him the nickname that would stick for the rest of his career. They called him Narvel the Marvel, a perfect encapsulation of the sense of wonder people felt when they heard him sing. It was a name spoken with genuine affection, a tribute to the miraculous voice that seemed to come from another world. Of course, there were some critics in Nashville who dismissed him as a cover artist, pointing out that many of his biggest hits were interpretations of songs from other genres. But this criticism fundamentally misunderstood his genius. Narvel Felts was a song stylist, an interpreter of the highest order. Like Elvis or Ray Charles before him, he possessed the rare alchemical talent of taking a familiar song and completely rebirthing it in his own image. He didn't just sing songs, he inhabited them, filtering them through his unique country soul perspective until they became indelibly his. By the late 1970s, Narvel Felts had achieved a level of success that must have seemed like an impossible fantasy just a few years earlier. The boy with the wire-strung guitar, the teenager who had nervously auditioned at Sun, the man who had worked odd jobs to support his family, he was now a bona fide superstar. He was a headliner, his name in lights, his voice a constant presence on the radio. He had wealth, fame, and the deep satisfaction of having proven every doubter wrong. He had reached the summit. From that magnificent height, the future looked limitless, a golden horizon of endless possibility. Fame, however, is a tide. As the 1980s arrived, the musical currents shifted again, and the high tide of Narvel's commercial success began to recede. This professional fade, a common story for even the greatest artists, was a challenge he was prepared for, but it would be utterly eclipsed by a personal event so catastrophic that it would render every career high and low meaningless. A long, dark shadow was about to fall, a tragedy that would test the limits of his endurance and forever change the meaning of every sad song he would ever sing again. Fame is a tide. It rolls in with a thunderous, exhilarating crash, and then, just as inevitably, it rolls out again, leaving behind a quiet, changed shoreline. For Narvel Felts, the late 1970s had been the high tide of his life. He had stood at the absolute summit of the country music world, a beloved star whose voice was a constant, reassuring presence on the airwaves. He had achieved a dream that had once seemed impossible, a victory not just for himself but for his family, who had weathered the long years of struggle alongside him. But the 1980s brought with them a new decade and a new tide. The musical currents were shifting once again, and the polished, soulful sound that had made Narvel a superstar began to recede. This next chapter in his story is not about a dramatic fall from grace, but about a slow professional fade, the kind that happens to even the greatest of artists. It's a story of adapting to a new reality as a legacy act, a working musician finding dignity and purpose outside the glare of the national spotlight. However, the professional challenges of this era would be utterly eclipsed by a personal event so catastrophic, so soul-shattering, that it would render every career high and low meaningless. A long, dark shadow was about to fall across Narvel's life, a tragedy so profound that it would test the very limits of his endurance and forever change the meaning of every sad song he would ever sing again. As the 1970s gave way to the 1980s, country music put on a pair of cowboy boots and a Stetson hat. The urban cowboy phenomenon, sparked by the 1980 John Travolta film, created a mainstream boom for a more pop-inflected, accessible brand of country. This was followed swiftly by the new traditionalist movement, a powerful backlash led by artists like George Strait, Ricky Skaggs, and Randy Travis. They championed a return to the roots of country music, the fiddles, steel guitars, and honest, straightforward storytelling of the honky-tonk era. In this new climate, the lush, string-laden, soulful sound of 1970s countrypolitan began to sound dated. The very style that had been Narvel's ticket to stardom was now falling out of fashion. Simultaneously, the music industry was in the throes of corporate consolidation. In 1979, Narvel's label, ABC Records, was sold and absorbed into the industry behemoth MCA Records. In the cold, impersonal calculus of these corporate mergers, artist rosters are often trimmed like dead weight. The focus shifts to younger, more marketable acts and blockbuster album sales. Veteran artists, even those with a string of recent hits, are often seen as yesterday's news. Narvel's last major chart success had been Everlasting Love in 1979. As the new decade began, his follow-up singles failed to climb as high. By the early 1980s, MCA Records quietly let his contract expire. There was no dramatic firing, no bitter public dispute. It was simply the way the business worked. After a glorious 5-year run at the top, Narvel Felts was once again without a major record label. For a man who had experienced the depths of the wilderness once before, this return to the outside looking in must have been a uniquely painful form of déjà vu. This time, however, he wasn't a struggling unknown. He was a respected star, but a star without a home. To be dropped by a major label could be a career death sentence. For Narvel Felts, it was a liberation. He was no longer bound by the pressures of chasing radio hits or conforming to the latest trends. He was free to be himself, a legacy artist with a loyal built-in fan base who loved him for the music he had already made. The 1980s and early 1990s saw him reinvent himself as a fiercely independent and hardworking musician. He released a series of solid albums on smaller independent labels, records made for his fans, not for the Nashville hit machine. He became a fixture on the touring circuit that is the lifeblood of established country acts. His schedule was a map of Middle America, state fairs, regional festivals, casinos, and the kinds of storied country music halls where his name on the marquee still guaranteed a full house. It wasn't the glamorous life of arena tours and television specials he had known in the 70s, but it was an honest and respectable living. He was, in the purest sense, a working musician. He loved to perform, he loved his fans, and this new phase of his career allowed him to connect with them directly, without the buffer of the industry machine. And throughout this period, a new and special partnership was developing. His son Bub, who had grown up watching his father's incredible comeback, was now a fine and accomplished drummer. Sometime in the 1980s, Bub joined his father's touring band. For Narvel, this must have been the single greatest joy of his professional life. The bond between a father and son can be a complicated thing, but on the road, sharing a stage, they found a unique connection. Narvel could look back from the microphone and see his own son laying down the steady beat behind him, a shared rhythm, a shared life. Imagine the pride he must have felt during band introductions. And on the drums, my son, Bub Felts. They were no longer just father and son. They were colleagues, musical collaborators sharing the highs and lows of life on the road, the long hours on the tour bus, the sound checks in empty halls, the roar of the crowd each night. It was an experience they built together. This partnership was the unexpected, beautiful reward for all the years of hard work. Life was good. He was in his 50s, in excellent voice, making a good living doing what he loved, with his son by his side. September 14th, 1995, likely began as an ordinary day in Dunklin County, Missouri. The late summer air was probably warm, the routines of life proceeding as they always did. Narvel was 56 years old, a contented man enjoying the fruits of a long and remarkable career. His son Bub was 31, a vibrant young man with a life full of music and promise. And then, in an instant of shattered glass and twisted metal on a lonely stretch of road in Campbell, Missouri, everything was destroyed. Bub Felts was killed in a car accident. He was gone. It is impossible to adequately describe the impact of such a phone call, such a knock on the door. It is the sound of a universe collapsing. For Narvel and Loretta, the news was not a tragedy. It was an apocalypse. It was the severing of the past, the destruction of the present, and the foreclosure of the future. The natural order of the world, where parents are not supposed to bury their children, was violently, irrevocably broken. The grief was a bottomless, silent chasm. This wasn't the poetic heartbreak of a country song. This was the raw, brutal, ragged edge of human suffering. The loss of a child is an amputation of the soul, a wound that never heals. For Narvel, the pain was cruelly amplified by their shared professional life. His son wasn't just his son, he was his drummer. He was the heartbeat of his band. Now the silence from that drum riser on stage would be a deafening roar. Every song they had played together, every mile they had traveled, every laugh they had shared on the bus, it all became a ghost, a source of unbearable pain. The greatest joy of Narvel's life, performing with his son, had been transformed into his greatest source of sorrow. The music, which had always been his sanctuary, his escape and his salvation, was now inextricably linked to his most profound loss. The thought of ever stepping on a stage again must have seemed not just impossible, but a form of torture. The days and weeks that followed Bub's death were a blur of unimaginable grief. The funeral was held at the Memorial Park Cemetery in Kennett, Missouri. The community, which had celebrated Narvel's triumphs, now gathered to share in his family's sorrow. Condolences poured in from fans and fellow musicians across the country, but such support, however heartfelt, could do little to fill the immense void. In the aftermath, Narvel's career ground to a halt. How could he possibly perform? How could he sing for others when his own heart was shattered into a million pieces? The joy was gone, replaced by a sorrow so vast it threatened to consume him. For a time, it seemed as if Narvel Felts might never sing again. The following year, in 1996, a new Best Of collection was released. While such albums are common for legacy artists, this one felt different. It felt like a memorial, a final statement, a career retrospective tinged with the ultimate sadness. For fans who knew the story, listening to those old hits was now a completely different experience. A song like "Reconsider Me," once a simple plea to a lover, now sounded like a father's desperate, impossible bargain with fate to reconsider the life of his child. And a song like "Lonely Teardrops," which he had performed with such joy and swagger for years, was transformed. It was no longer a cover of a Jackie Wilson classic. It was now Narvel's own story. It was a raw, public testament to his grief, a window into a father's broken heart. Slowly, tentatively, he did begin to perform again. It was an act of almost unimaginable courage. Stepping back onto a stage, looking at the empty drum stool behind him, must have taken every ounce of strength he possessed. The performances were different now. The easygoing, charismatic showman of the 70s was gone, replaced by a figure of immense, quiet dignity. His voice was still there, as powerful and as clear as ever, but now it carried a new weight, a new depth of sorrow that was unmistakable. When he sang a ballad, he wasn't acting anymore, he was testifying. The audience was no longer just watching a concert. They were bearing witness to a man's brave, heartbreaking attempt to sing his way through an unspeakable pain. The tragedy had not ended his career. Instead, it had transformed him into something more than a star. It had made him a survivor. The years of chasing fame were over, rendered meaningless by the crushing weight of loss. What remained was a man left to navigate the silent landscape of grief, where the question was no longer how to make a hit, but how to make a life. This final chapter is not about a comeback, but about endurance. It's about how music transforms from a profession into a form of prayer, and how a legacy is ultimately defined not by public applause, but by the quiet dignity of a life lived through both triumph and unimaginable sorrow. Every story has an end, but a life in music never truly falls silent. The notes linger, echoing in the memories of those who heard them. The voice, captured in the grooves of a record, becomes a permanent ghost, a timeless whisper of joy, of heartbreak, of a life lived. For Narvel Felts, the aftermath of his son's death was not an ending, but the beginning of the final, longest, and quietest chapter of his story. The years of chasing fame, of topping the charts, of playing to roaring arenas, that life was over, rendered insignificant by the crushing weight of his loss. What remained was a man, a husband, and a father, left to navigate the silent landscape of grief. The question was no longer how to make a hit, but how to make a life. This final chapter is not about a comeback or a resurgence. It is a story of endurance. It's about how a man learns to live alongside a ghost, how music transforms from a profession into a form of prayer, and how a legacy is ultimately defined not by the noise of public applause, but by the quiet dignity of a life well and truly lived through both triumph and unimaginable sorrow. In the years following the tragedy, the bright lights of the national music scene faded into a distant memory for Narvel. The thought of returning to the grueling, impersonal life of a touring musician held no appeal. His world had shrunk by necessity and by choice to the things that mattered most: his wife Loretta, his family, and his home in Missouri. His career, once a soaring rocket, settled into a gentle local orbit. He didn't stop performing. The music was too deeply embedded in his soul for that, but the stages became smaller, the audiences more intimate. He played community theaters, local festivals, and small town halls, primarily in Missouri and the surrounding states. These were not concerts, they were gatherings. He was no longer a distant superstar on a pedestal, but a neighbor, a friend, sharing the songs and stories of his life with the people who had been with him from the very beginning. His set list began to change. Of course, he played the hits. The crowd still wanted to hear Drift Away and Reconsider Me, and he sang them with a new, profound depth. But woven between these beloved classics were more and more gospel songs. The spiritual music of his Delta childhood, which had always been a part of his foundation, now moved to the forefront. Songs of faith, redemption, and the promise of a life hereafter were no longer just a part of his repertoire. They were a personal testament. When Narvel sang a hymn like "Precious Lord, Take My Hand," it was with the raw, heartfelt conviction of a man who had walked through the darkest of valleys and was leaning on his faith to survive. These performances were incredibly powerful, a shared experience of comfort and reflection between the artist and his audience. His stage had transformed from a platform for entertainment into a kind of pulpit where the sermons were about resilience, hope, and the enduring power of the human spirit. History will not place Narvel Felts on the Mount Rushmore of American music alongside Elvis Presley or Johnny Cash. His name may not be the first to come to mind in a discussion of country music's greatest legends, but his legacy is no less significant for its subtlety. He is one of the most important bridge artists of his generation, a crucial, often overlooked link in the chain of American popular music. As a rockabilly pioneer, his early Sun recordings possess an authentic, untamed energy that stands with the best of the genre. He was there at the creation, a true first-generation rocker. As a country soul interpreter, he was years ahead of his time. His genius was his ability to hear the shared DNA in different styles of music, to find the country heart in a soul song or the bluesy ache in a pop ballad. He erased genre lines, following the emotional truth of a song wherever it led. Countless country singers who followed in the 70s and 80s, who blended soulful vocals with country themes, owe an unacknowledged debt to the path that Narvel Felts forged. Beyond the music, however, is his legacy of character. In an industry notorious for its excesses and its casualties, Narvel stands as a monument to decency and quiet strength. He was the star who chose his family over fame during the 1960s. He was the devoted husband, sharing a lifelong partnership with his wife Loretta that endured every imaginable trial. He was the humble artist who, even at the peak of his fame, remained grounded, never losing the perspective of the poor farm boy from Arkansas. His greatest legacy, then, may be that of a survivor. He survived the poverty of the Depression-era South. He survived the brutal, competitive music scene of the 1950s. He survived a decade of professional obscurity in the 1960s. And, most importantly, he survived the crushing grief of losing his child. His life story is a masterclass in resilience, a testament to the idea that true strength isn't the absence of pain, but the courage to continue in spite of it. As the years turned into decades, the sharp, acute pain of Bub's death settled into a permanent, quiet ache. It is a loss that time does not heal. It simply reshapes itself, becoming a part of the landscape of one's soul. For Narvel and his family, the memory of Bub remains an ever-present part of their lives. Even today, in the age of social media, 30 years after the accident, the family continues to post photos and share memories of their son. It is a touching modern expression of a timeless truth. The conversation with those we love never truly ends. Through it all, the one constant in Narvel's life, the unwavering anchor in every storm, has been his wife, Loretta. She is the unspoken hero of this entire story. She was with him when he was a teenager with a wire-strung guitar. She was with him through the struggles of the wilderness years, raising a family while he chased a fading dream. She was with him at the height of his superstardom, a grounding force amid the chaos of fame. And most critically, she was with him in the silent, devastated aftermath of their son's death, sharing a grief that only they could truly understand. Their enduring, lifelong partnership is perhaps the most beautiful song he has ever been a part of, a quiet duet of love, loyalty, and shared survival. Today, in the year 2025, Narvel Felts is 86 years old. He lives a quiet life in Malden, Missouri, the state that became his home so many decades ago. The roar of the crowds has long since faded, replaced by the gentle rhythms of a life far from the spotlight. He is a grandfather now, a respected elder, a living link to a formative era of American history. His story is a profound and moving American epic. It is a story of a boy born into poverty who, through sheer talent and unbreakable will, touched the stars. It is a story of the complex, often cruel machinery of the music industry. But in the end, it is a story about the fundamental, unshakable power of love, family, and faith. Narvel Felts' life teaches us that a career is not a life. It teaches us that success is fragile, and that fame is fleeting, but that the bonds of family can endure even the most unimaginable heartbreak. He is the boy from the cotton fields with a dream, the rockabilly rebel, the country superstar, and the grieving father who learned to sing again. They are all the same man. His greatest hit was not a song that topped the charts, but the quiet courage he displayed every time he stepped on a stage after his world fell apart. His most lasting legacy is not his record sales, but the simple, powerful example of a life lived with integrity, humility, and a grace that could not be broken. The last verse of his song is one of quiet peace, a testament to the enduring strength of a truly marvelous human spirit.